1972. The fourth king of Bhutan, Jigme Sinji Wangchuk, is 17 years old. He's just ascended to the throne of a small Himalayan kingdom, wedged between China and India, one of the poorest countries in the world. And he says something surprising. He says that gross national happiness is more important than gross national product. The world ignores him. A teenage king from a tiny country talking about happiness instead of economics. Nobody takes it seriously. 37 years later, in 2009, three of the most prestigious economists on the planet, Joseph Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fatoussi, publish a report commissioned by the President of France. Their conclusion is devastating: GDP, as it's used, is a profoundly incomplete measure of a nation's progress. It turns out that teenage king was asking the right question. We started this season by measuring economies with GDP. We built everything else on that foundation: unemployment, cycles, growth, trade, the relationships between output and inflation. But today, in the last episode, we step back and ask an uncomfortable question. Is GDP the right measure of progress? Or have we spent decades optimizing the wrong indicator? We won't give a definitive answer, because there isn't one. But we'll explore the most serious critiques of GDP, the alternatives that have been proposed, and the unresolved tension between measuring production and measuring well-being. Let's recall what GDP is: the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period. That definition leaves out many things. And what it leaves out is not trivial. The first absence is unpaid work. When a mother takes care of her children, it doesn't count in GDP. When a father cooks for his family, it doesn't count. When a volunteer dedicates hours to a neighborhood association, it doesn't count. But if those same people hire someone to do exactly the same work, then it does count. The work is the same. The value is the same. But one appears in the statistics and the other doesn't. Estimates vary, but some studies suggest unpaid domestic work equals between 10 and 40% of GDP in developed countries. That's an enormous part of real economic activity that simply vanishes from official figures. The second absence is inequality. GDP per capita tells us the average. But an average can hide any distribution imaginable. A country where 10 people earn €1,000,000 and 90 earn 10,000 has a per capita GDP of €109,000. Sounds prosperous. But 90 out of 100 people live on very little. GDP doesn't distinguish between a country where wealth is reasonably shared and one where it's concentrated in a few hands. And that distinction matters enormously for the population's well-being. The third absence is the environment. When a company fells a forest and sells the timber, GDP goes up. But the forest is gone. The services it provided, clean air, climate regulation, biodiversity, water, don't appear in any accounting. GDP records the gain but not the loss. The same goes for pollution. A factory polluting a river generates production that counts in GDP. But the cost of that pollution, illness, lost fishing, future cleanup, isn't subtracted. It's like a business that counts revenue but ignores expenses. The fourth absence is the underground economy. Everything produced and exchanged outside the legal and tax system, from off-the-books work to drug trafficking. In some countries, the underground economy can be 20 or 30% of actual activity. Long before economists wrote technical reports about GDP's limitations, a politician said it in language anyone could understand. On March 18, 1968, Robert Kennedy spoke at the University of Kansas. In that speech, he listed everything: gross national product counts, air pollution, tobacco advertising, ambulances picking up the injured on highways, locks on doors, and prisons for those who break through them. And then he said what it doesn't count. It doesn't count the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. It doesn't include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages. It measures neither our wit nor our courage. And he concluded, GDP measures everything, in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. 3 months later, Kennedy was assassinated. But his words kept resonating for decades. Over the years, several attempts have tried to build something better than GDP. Or at least complement it. The best known is the Human Development Index, the HDI, created in 1990 by Pakistani economist Mahbub-ul Haq with the collaboration of philosopher and economist Amartya Sen. The HDI combines 3 dimensions: life expectancy at birth as a measure of health, years of schooling as a measure of education, and per capita income as a measure of material living standards. Sen's idea, which inspired the HDI, is what he called the capabilities approach. It doesn't only matter how much money people have. What matters is what they can do and what they can be. Can they live a long, healthy life? Can they get an education? Can they participate in community life? The HDI doesn't replace GDP, but it offers a more complete picture. Countries with similar GDP per capita can have very different HDIs. Cuba has a modest GDP but a high HDI, thanks to its health and education indicators. Equatorial Guinea has a high GDP per capita due to oil, but a much lower HDI. Another alternative is the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. The GPI starts with personal consumption, like GDP, but adds things GDP ignores, like the value of housework and volunteering. And it subtracts things GDP counts as positive but that are negative for well-being, pollution, natural resource depletion, the cost of crime, the loss of leisure time. In many countries, the GPI and GDP move together until roughly the 70s. Then they diverge. GDP keeps rising. The GPI stagnates or falls, suggesting that additional economic growth no longer translates into real improvements in well-being. And then there's Bhutan's gross national happiness. It's not just a slogan. It's a detailed index with 9 dimensions: psychological well-being, health, education, time use, cultural diversity, good governance, community vitality, ecological diversity, and living standards. Bhutan actually uses it. Before approving any public policy, they evaluate its impact on gross national happiness. It's a fascinating experiment. Imperfect, certainly, but fascinating. In 1974, economist Richard Easterlin discovered something baffling. Within a country, richer people say they're happier than poorer ones. That surprises no one. But when he compared countries over time, he found that sustained increases in per capita income didn't translate into sustained increases in reported happiness. The United States was much richer in the 70s than in the 50s. But Americans didn't say they were happier. This is the Easterlin paradox. Beyond a certain income threshold, more money doesn't mean more happiness at the collective level. The paradox has its critics. Some recent studies suggest the relationship between income and subjective well-being doesn't disappear entirely, it just weakens. The debate continues. But the fundamental intuition seems solid. Once basic needs are met, what most affects people's well-being isn't how much they have, but how they compare with others, how secure they feel, what social relationships they have, how much control they perceive over their lives. And none of those things shows up in GDP. In 2009, French President Nicolas Sarkozy asked Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi to investigate whether GDP was an adequate measure of economic and social progress. The final report, published that year, was forceful. They recommended countries stop relying exclusively on GDP and adopt a panel of indicators including income distribution, environmental sustainability, health, education, and subjective quality of life. Since then, the movement has gained momentum. In 2019, New Zealand presented the first national budget organized explicitly around well-being rather than GDP growth. Instead of asking how much the economy will grow, the government asked, how will these policies improve people's lives? Scotland, Iceland, and Wales formed the Wellbeing Economy Governments Partnership. The OECD developed its own Better Life Index. The United Nations measures the Sustainable Development Goals. The movement is real. But it's also fragmented. There's no consensus on what should replace GDP, or even whether it should be replaced or simply supplemented. It would be unfair to close this episode without presenting the other side. Defenders of GDP argue, rightly, that it was never designed to measure well-being. It was designed to measure economic activity. And it does that well. GDP is comparable across countries and over time. It has a standardized methodology. It's calculated quarterly in nearly every country. It's the foundation for monetary and fiscal policy decisions worldwide. None of the proposed alternatives has those characteristics. The HDI is simple but limited. The GPI is more comprehensive but its calculation is enormously subjective. Gross national happiness works in Bhutan but is hard to replicate universally. The problem isn't GDP itself. The problem is having turned a measure of production into a measure of progress. GDP never said more production meant more well-being. We're the ones who assumed that. What does this mean for people? It means that when a government announces GDP has grown, that says nothing automatically about whether people's lives have improved. GDP can grow while real wages stagnate. It can grow while inequality increases. It can grow while the environment degrades. And conversely, a society can improve in health, education, social cohesion, and environmental sustainability without GDP reflecting that improvement. GDP is a flashlight. It illuminates part of the room. But not all of it. And if we only look where the flashlight points, we miss much of what really matters. The question isn't whether we should abandon GDP. The question is whether we should keep treating it as the only measure of success. The fundamental ideas from this final episode. First, GDP doesn't capture unpaid work, inequality, environmental degradation, or the underground economy. These are enormous absences. Second, the main alternatives are the Human Development Index, the Genuine Progress Indicator, and Bhutan's Gross National Happiness. Each offers valuable perspectives, but none has managed to replace GDP. Third, the Easterlin paradox suggests that beyond a certain income threshold, more wealth doesn't translate into more happiness at the collective level. Fourth, the Beyond GDP movement is growing, with initiatives like the Stiglitz-Sunfatusi Commission, New Zealand's Wellbeing Budget, and OECD indices. But there's no consensus on a replacement. Fifth, GDP isn't bad. It measures what it was designed to measure: economic activity. The error has been making it synonymous with progress. With this episode, we close Season 7. We've measured economies, analyzed their cycles, and questioned their goals. But how did we get here? Modern capitalism didn't appear overnight. It grew out of a world of feudal lords, serfs, and hereditary obligations. In Season 8, we travel 1,000 years back to trace the transformation from feudalism to the system that rules the world today. From medieval guilds and trade fairs to the Industrial Revolution and the birth of the labor movement. See you there.